My name is Mary. After my husband's funeral, when I was broken with grief, my own son and daughter threw me out of the house, saying, "You are responsible. You didn't take care of our father." Like I was nothing. Just nothing. Quick question. Where are you watching from? Comment your city below. I want to see how far my story has traveled. And maybe we're neighbors. Can you imagine feeling completely shattered and instead of comfort, the people you gave everything to turn on you? I couldn't even cry at first. I just stood there, numb, listening to their words, feeling them slice through my chest. My daughter's eyes were cold, my son's jaw tight, and the rage in their voices wasn't even disguised as grief. It was pure accusation, pure blame, and it hit me harder than the coffin they just lowered into the ground. I tried to speak, to tell them I had done everything I could. I reminded them of the nights I stayed awake when their father was sick, how I nursed him back to moments of health, how I carried him when he couldn't stand. But it was like talking to a wall. Every word I uttered bounced off them and returned as another dagger. "You never cared," they screamed. "You only think about yourself." And just like that, I was out. They pushed me away, kicked me from the house I had lived in for decades, the home that held our family memories, the home that should have held me safe. I had nothing. No home, no family, no one. I remember sitting on the curb, the funeral flowers wilted beside me, the wind biting at my cheeks. I kept thinking, how could they hate me? How could my own children believe I would harm the person I loved more than anything in the world? And yet, there I was, discarded like garbage. I wanted to scream at the universe, "Do you see this? This is what betrayal looks like." I could feel my heart cracking into pieces, each beat a reminder that my family, the people I had devoted my life to, had turned their backs on me in my darkest hour. But here's the thing. They didn't know. They had no idea that the man they blamed me for losing, their father, had left me with something they couldn't even imagine. Their father was a multimillionaire, a secret I had never flaunted, a private world they had no access to. And before he died, when he knew the end was near, he made sure every bit of his wealth, every bank account, every property, every asset would be mine. He protected me, even from them. Can you imagine the mix of grief and anger swirling inside me when I realized that? I had nothing, yet I had everything. The universe had just handed me the cards, and I was about to play them. I didn't rush. No, I sat there for a while, letting their words echo in my mind, letting their betrayal sink in fully. I wanted to feel it all, every ounce of the pain and disbelief, because I knew that understanding it would fuel what came next. They had turned me into a victim, yes, but they had also made the mistake of underestimating me. And I promise you, that was the fatal error. I started planning quietly, because the best revenge isn't loud. It doesn't scream. It whispers, it creeps, and then, when the time is right, it shatters everything the other person thought they controlled. I would not be the grieving, powerless mother they thought I was. I would become something else, something stronger, something unstoppable. I could already see it in my mind, the look on their faces when they realized the tables had turned, when the people who had dismissed me would beg for my attention, for my forgiveness, for any trace of connection I had once offered freely. But first, I needed to rebuild. I needed to rise from the ashes they thought I belonged in. And so, with nothing but a burning sense of injustice and the secret inheritance they had no clue about, I started planning my return. It wasn't about money, though money would play a part. No, this was about pride, about proving that you don't betray the wrong person, about showing them that cruelty and ignorance have consequences. And believe me, when they saw me again, they would never, ever forget it. I know what you're thinking. Would you have waited this long for payback? Be honest with yourself, because when you've been hurt like that, thrown away like garbage,
the idea of revenge isn't just tempting, it becomes necessary. It becomes a pulse in your veins, a whisper in the back of your mind, telling you to prepare, to wait, to strike at exactly the right moment. And I was already listening to that whisper.
The nights that followed were some of the loneliest I've ever known. I slept on a tiny rented apartment mattress, one that sank beneath me like it wanted to swallow my sorrow whole. Every creak of the building, every muffled laugh from neighbors in their warm-filled homes felt like a reminder that I had been cast aside, that my own children had chosen to erase me from their lives. And yet, in that crushing loneliness, I felt something else, a flicker, a spark I hadn't felt in years, a sense of clarity, sharp and cold, cutting through the fog of grief. I had survived worse than this before, and I could survive this too. I kept replaying their words in my head. You didn't care. You didn't do enough. You're nothing. I thought about every moment I had spent at their father's side, nursing him when he was too weak to stand, holding him when the pain racked his body, comforting him when the fear in his eyes was too much to bear. And yet to them, none of it mattered. None of it. I felt tears burn the corners of my eyes, but I refused to let them fall. Not yet. Not here. Because this wasn't the end of my story. This was the beginning of it. And then I remembered the papers. Hidden in a safe I had never touched, sealed and signed, were documents that transferred everything, the house, the cars, the investments, the accounts, to me. I had known about the inheritance, yes, but I had never imagined I would need it so soon, and certainly not under these circumstances. Their father had trusted me, protected me, even from their own misguided judgments. He had made sure that when the time came, I would have the power to rise again, and now I was ready. I started small. Quietly, methodically, I began reclaiming my independence. I found a modest bank, accessed the accounts, and began transferring funds to a secure place only I could reach. I researched real estate, hired discreet consultants, and started planning the first move in a game my children didn't even know they were playing. And all the while, I remembered every cruel word, every dismissive glance, every shove and accusation. Those memories became my fuel. Each insult, each betrayal etched into my mind like fire, sharpened my focus, and I realized something terrifying. I wasn't just angry. I was ready. I watched them from a distance. They didn't see me. They didn't know I existed beyond their fleeting anger and misunderstanding. And yet, I saw everything. Their arrogance, their assumptions, the way they strutted through the house I had once called home as if they were entitled to it. It made me sick, but it also gave me clarity. They had no idea what was coming, and I wanted them to feel that shock. I wanted them to know the magnitude of their mistake, to understand that power isn't always visible, and the person you underestimate is often the one who will deliver the hardest blow. The first time I drove past their street, in my new car, a sleek, glossy Rolls-Royce, something I had purchased quietly, a symbol of the life they had denied me, I saw them through the window. Their mouths dropped open. You could see it. Confusion, disbelief, fear. It was intoxicating. And in that moment, I realized just how far I had come from the grieving, helpless widow they thought I was. I had stepped into a new identity, one they couldn't touch, one they couldn't comprehend. I thought about confronting them immediately, about barging into their lives and forcing them to acknowledge me. But no, revenge isn't a scream. Revenge is a whisper that grows until it roars. It is patience, planning, and precision. I would strike in a way that left no room for denial, no chance for excuse. I would let them beg, let them plead, and then, only then, would I reveal the full measure of what they had lost by underestimating me. And I have to ask you this.
If you were in my shoes, if your own children had thrown you out, blamed you for a death you had nothing to do with, would you have waited? Could you have waited? There's a power in patience, a dangerous kind of satisfaction in letting people believe they have won while you quietly gather every tool you need to turn the tables. I was learning that lesson with every calculated step I took, every quiet transaction, every moment of planning in the dark. I started thinking bigger. The house across the street, the one I had my eyes on, became the focal point of the plan. It wasn't just a property, it was a symbol, a statement. The day I signed the purchase papers, I felt a rush unlike anything I had experienced since their father passed. I was no longer the grieving widow. I was someone reborn, someone with the means, the intelligence, and the patience to make them pay in a way they couldn't ignore. And make no mistake, they would beg. They would crawl. They would realize too late that they had dismissed a force they could never contain. The day I moved into my new house, I felt a thrill that I didn't expect. It wasn't just the luxury. The high ceilings, the sparkling floors, the way sunlight poured through every window. It was the knowledge that I was standing, finally, on my own terms. My son and daughter had imagined me broken, helpless, wandering the streets like a shadow of my former self, and instead, I was here, whole, powerful, untouchable. It was almost laughable, the contrast between their perception and reality. I saw them across the street that very evening, peering through their living room windows as if they could make sense of the sight in front of them. Me, in a flowing silk dress, stepping out of a Rolls-Royce with my head held high, carrying myself with a calm I didn't entirely feel inside, but projected perfectly. Their jaws dropped, their eyes wide, and I could feel the panic radiating off them even from that distance. It was subtle at first. Just a flicker in their expressions, but I knew it was there. I had planted the seed. I didn't rush to them. No, I walked around my garden, polished my car, arranged flowers in the lobby, and let them stew. I watched them from the corner of my eye, their whispered conversations, their frantic glances, the way they moved through the house now with a cautiousness I hadn't seen before. Their sense of control was slipping. It was intoxicating, and in that moment, I felt a small, private victory. They had underestimated me. They had thrown me out, dismissed me, and now they were powerless to stop the life I had reclaimed. The next day, I received a text from my daughter, short and trembling. "Mom, we need to talk." My heart thumped, not with relief, but with the power of knowing that she was finally coming to me on my terms. But I didn't reply immediately. Oh no, that would have been too easy. The art of revenge isn't in the first strike. It's in the anticipation, the slow tightening of the tension until it can't be ignored. I wanted them to feel the fear, the uncertainty, the gnawing anxiety that comes from realizing the person you pushed aside has returned with something you cannot control. I started small experiments, subtle gestures that reminded them who I was and what they had lost. Away from the balcony, a well-timed smile as I passed by their driveway, and the soft click of my Rolls-Royce door as I arrived home. Each moment was a calculated move, a chess piece sliding across the board. They noticed. Oh, they noticed. I could see it in their faces, the shift from disbelief to panic, from smug superiority to cautious suspicion. And let me tell you, it never gets old watching someone realize they've misjudged you so completely. One evening, I hosted a small gathering of neighbors and acquaintances, people who had never met me before, yet had heard whispers of my return. The luxury, the effortless charm, the way I carried myself, it all created a spectacle they couldn't ignore, and as they watched from across the street, I saw them exchange glances, frantic, whispering, trying to make sense of the woman they thought they had destroyed. I even caught my son muttering under his breath, How did she do this?"
I smiled quietly, knowing that inside they were starting to regret every harsh word, every push, every accusation. But this was just the beginning. I needed them to feel the full weight of their actions. Money and property weren't the only tools. Fear, pride, and desperation were equally effective weapons. I began to plan how I would systematically take back what they thought they had won: control over the household, over their sense of security, even over their emotional stability. I wasn't cruel, I was precise. And believe me, there's a difference. I had nights where I lay awake imagining every reaction, every conversation. Would they cry first? Would they beg? Would my son finally look me in the eye without hatred? Finally see the truth? These weren't idle fantasies. They were blueprints, rehearsal for the storm I was about to unleash. And in those moments, I felt a something I hadn't felt in years: clarity, purpose, power. It's a dangerous feeling, isn't it? To know that you have the ability to reshape the world around you one calculated move at a time. And now I have to ask you, if it were you standing across from the people who had thrown you out, watching them realize the tables had turned, what would you have done? Would you have rushed in, desperate for recognition? Or would you have savored it, slowly, letting them squirm in the anxiety of their own ignorance? Because patience, my friends, is the cruelest weapon of all, and I had mastered it. From that point forward, everything I did was deliberate. Every purchase, every appearance, every subtle reminder that I was no longer powerless was a piece of the plan. My children were beginning to bend, to realize that they were no longer in control. And let me tell you, there's no greater satisfaction than watching people grapple with the consequences of their own cruelty while you remain untouched, untouchable, and silently triumphant. I knew I couldn't just stop at appearances. Showing them I had wealth wasn't enough. They needed to feel the consequences of their betrayal, to understand that every cruel word, every shove, every accusation had led them here, powerless and scrambling. And so I began the careful, deliberate work of reclaiming what they thought they had stolen from me. Not with anger, not with shouting, but with precision. First came the practical moves: buying key properties around them, establishing a presence they couldn't ignore. I purchased a few local businesses they had dismissed, quietly at first, then more openly, ensuring the neighborhood began to whisper my name with respect, curiosity, and a hint of fear. Every transaction was calculated, every investment deliberate. I watched them notice, watched them check my license plates, watch me from their windows, and I loved it. I could see their minds racing, trying to piece together how this had happened so fast, how the woman they threw out could suddenly be untouchable. But money alone wasn't the full plan. No, revenge is an art. It's about leverage, about turning someone's own ignorance against them. I began researching them quietly, learning about their routines, their insecurities, the small cracks in their armor they never imagined I would notice. My son, arrogant and dismissive, had a weakness for reputation. My daughter, sensitive and impulsive, feared public embarrassment. These little threads became the backbone of my plan, the tools I would use to weave the perfect storm. And the moments of tension were delicious. I would time my appearances just right, standing in places where they couldn't ignore me. At the local cafe, arriving just as they entered. In the neighborhood, waving casually, as if our worlds had always intersected. Every gesture was subtle, yet loaded with power. I could see the panic in their eyes, the unease, the whispers of doubt. Who is she now? What does she want? How did this happen so fast? And I let them wonder. I let them stew in that uncertainty because it was more satisfying than any confrontation. Of course, obstacles appeared. My son tried to approach me once, arrogance twisting his voice into something sharp. "Mary, we need to talk.
Now." I smiled, a slow, knowing smile. "Oh, I'm listening," I said, and he faltered, realizing that the balance of power had shifted completely. That day, he left without a word, his confidence shattered, a seed of fear planted deep. My daughter, too, tried to charm me with apologies dripping in insincerity, but I held back, observing, measuring, letting them feel the hunger of needing my attention while I gave them none. Every move had to be perfect. Timing was everything. I couldn't rush it. Revenge isn't about satisfaction in the moment. It's about constructing a crescendo, a sequence of events that leaves the person gasping, completely undone by their own actions. I spent nights plotting, detailing every step, every scenario, every possible reaction. And when they began whispering to each other, panicked, trying to figure out how I had amassed this wealth, I knew the plan was working. There were close calls, of course. I had to navigate nosy neighbors, nosy colleagues, even a few opportunists who tried to ingratiate themselves, thinking they could exploit me. But I was careful. I smiled, I nodded, I played the part, all while keeping my eyes on the bigger picture. One false move and the balance could tip, but I thrived in that tension. The adrenaline of executing the plan flawlessly was intoxicating, more thrilling than any victory I had imagined. And then came the subtle, personal strikes, the small moments that would haunt them the most. A carefully delivered invitation to an event they weren't allowed to attend. The subtle display of my wealth and places they frequented. The whispers of my success in the corridors of the neighborhoods and businesses they knew. Every action was a reminder. They had thrown me out, dismissed me, underestimated me. And now they were helpless spectators to my ascent. I started asking myself quietly, in the middle of the night, would you have waited this long for revenge? And the answer was clear. Yes. Waiting, observing, planning, this was the most satisfying kind of revenge. To see someone realize too late the magnitude of their misjudgment, to watch them squirm in helplessness while you remain untouchable, that is a power unlike any other. And believe me, my children would soon feel the full weight of that power. With every calculated move, every whispered rumor, every shadow of fear I cast across their lives, the final act drew closer. I could see it in their eyes now. The panic, the desperation, the realization that the woman they thought they had destroyed was in fact the one holding the strings. And the taste of that moment, the anticipation, the slow, sweet unfolding of what was to come, it was more than satisfaction. It was vindication. It was justice. The first real strike came subtly, almost imperceptibly, but it hit them harder than anything I could have shouted in anger. I arranged for an exclusive charity gala in the neighborhood, a gathering of influential people, business moguls, and media whispers that none of them had access to. Invitations went out quietly, elegantly, and mine, of course, was the centerpiece. My presence there wasn't just to be seen, it was to be admired, envied, and feared.
I watched from across the room as they arrived late, hesitant, unsure of where to stand, how to act. My son's face went pale the moment he saw the crowd's attention shift, their eyes following me, drawn by elegance, confidence, and wealth he couldn't touch. My daughter tried to hide her discomfort behind forced smiles and polite nods, but I saw it. The settled trembling of her hands, the shallow breaths, the tiny movements betraying panic. This was no longer about wealth. This was about status, perception, power, and suddenly they had none. After the gala, I made sure the whispers reached them. Casual comments from neighbors, strategically overheard about my Rolls Royce, my new properties, my influence. I watched them realize that the world they thought they controlled, the neighborhood they walked through with pride, was now subtly, completely mine, and there was nothing they could do to stop it. The next step was closer, more personal. I began arranging small interactions, always public, always loaded with meaning. A friendly wave across the street while driving past in the Rolls. A casually dropped comment to a neighbor they couldn't overhear fully, but could guess at. A simple smile in the cafe where they were forced to sit nearby. Each moment reminded them that I was everywhere, untouchable, and always superior. The subtle terror in their eyes was like fuel to my fire, but I wasn't done, far from it. Then came the letters. Not angry letters, not confrontational letters, no, nothing so obvious. Just carefully worded notes slipped under their doors. Reminders of the inheritance, of the wealth they had dismissed, of the luxury they would never attain without me. They started reading them at first with confusion, then irritation, then panic. The realization sank in. The woman they had thrown into the street had returned, and she was untouchable, and they had no control over her, no leverage, no recourse. One evening, I decided it was time to test the breaking point. I invited them for a family dinner at my house, not as their mother, not as someone seeking reconciliation, but as the one holding everything they ever wanted. I watched their hesitation as they pulled up, my Rolls parked conspicuously outside, my house gleaming, every light and shadow designed to overwhelm. The look on their faces when they realized I had orchestrated this, that I held the power entirely in my hands, was priceless. During dinner, I spoke softly, deliberately, calmly, allowing each word to sink in. "You know," I said, letting the pause linger just long enough for them to squirm, "it's interesting how people sometimes assume the worst about those closest to them." Their eyes darted nervously, searching for anger, for retaliation, for some sign I was breaking, but I didn't. Calm, collected, untouchable, I was everything they feared. And then I asked the question, slowly, almost teasingly, "Do you understand now what you lost by throwing me out?" My daughter's lips trembled, my son's hands clenched, and I felt the weight of years of betrayal finally reflected back at me in raw fear and regret. They were starting to grasp it. Too late, of course. And the delicious tension of that moment, the power I had over their emotions, was intoxicating. But the best part was still to come. I didn't need to yell, to scream, to humiliate them openly. No. The true art of revenge is subtle, psychological, and precise. I left them that night with only the lingering sense that everything they had taken for granted, their father's affection, their family's unity, their sense of security, was gone. I didn't gloat. I didn't flaunt. I simply existed in my power, letting them stew in helplessness, letting their imaginations fill in the rest. I had to ask myself again, quietly, would you have waited this long for the satisfaction of watching them realize the truth? And the answer was always yes. Watching someone you love, someone you trusted, crumble under the weight of their own mistakes, knowing that you've orchestrated it with patience and precision, that is the kind of victory that nothing else can replicate. And now, they were beginning to understand that. Slowly, terrifyingly, completely. After that dinner, I knew I had them right where I wanted them, but I also knew that revenge isn't about a single moment. It's about layers, steps, escalation. One wave of fear or shame isn't enough. You have to build it, brick by brick, until the person realizes the full extent of what they lost and the power you now hold. And that's exactly what I started doing. I began subtly taking over areas of their lives they hadn't even noticed were vulnerable. A few properties here, small investments there, discreetly acquiring things that directly touched their routines, their comfort zones. Nothing aggressive, nothing that would alert them immediately, but enough that they could start feeling the shift. Their sense of control, once absolute, began to fray. Every time they'd tried to assert dominance, to act like life was normal, they ran into invisible walls I'd built, one after another.
My son, ever arrogant, tried to challenge me once. He cornered me near the cafe and said, "Mary, I don't understand how you came back like this. What are you trying to prove?" I smiled, the kind of calm smile that hides storms. "I'm not proving anything," I said. "I'm reminding you of what happens when you misjudge someone." His face paled, and I could see the panic starting to creep in, the first real hint that my plan was working. My daughter, desperate for reconciliation, sent messages filled with guilt and faux regret, begging me to forgive them, to come back as if nothing had happened. I didn't reply. Not because I was heartless, but because letting them sit with that need, the yearning for approval, for connection they had discarded, was far more powerful than any lecture or argument I could deliver. Their desperation became my ally, my tool, a weapon sharper than any confrontation. And then there were close calls, moments that could have ruined everything. Opportunists started to cozy up to me, thinking they could manipulate me or get a piece of my wealth. Nosy neighbors started asking questions, trying to piece together the story behind my sudden return. But I navigated each obstacle like a chess master. Every conversation, every encounter was measured. I smiled, nodded, and kept my true power hidden behind a veneer of elegance and calm. Any misstep could have tipped the balance, but I thrived under that pressure. One particularly tense evening, I drove past their house, my Rolls-Royce gleaming under the streetlights, and caught sight of them through the window, whispering frantically. My son's hands were over his face, his voice tense and low. "We've underestimated her. We need to fix this." My daughter shook her head, panic in her eyes. "There's nothing we can do. Nothing." And in that moment, I felt the thrill of watching them realize the scope of their error, the magnitude of their misjudgment. I began to plant more subtle reminders, things that hit close to home, invitations to events they couldn't attend, mentions of my business moves that directly affected their routines, whispers from neighbors and associates that slowly chipped away at their confidence. Every step was deliberate, designed to make them feel powerless while I remained untouchable, always one step ahead. I have to pause here and ask, can you imagine the satisfaction of watching people you loved, people you trusted, scramble helplessly, realizing they've lost the very person they thought they could dismiss? That gnawing panic, the self-doubt, the fear creeping in, it's intoxicating. That's what I felt every time I watched them stumble through their days, trying to regain control over a situation they created but no longer understood. And then, the breaking point. My son made a mistake. One small, arrogant move trying to assert dominance in a local meeting, only to find that I had already secured the deal he thought was his. The shock on his face, the realization that I had orchestrated it behind the scenes, was priceless. My daughter called me, trembling, begging me to explain, to help, to forgive. And I listened, letting her voice crack with desperation, knowing full well that I had orchestrated every single step that brought them to this point. Every close call, every tense moment, every subtle maneuver reinforced one truth. They had underestimated me. They had thrown me away, assumed I was powerless, and in doing so, they had handed me the tools to dismantle the world they thought they controlled. And slowly,
beautifully. They were beginning to realize it. The moment had finally come. After months of planning, of careful observation, of subtle strikes and psychological pressure, I was ready for the full reveal. This wasn't about money alone anymore. It was about demonstrating in no uncertain terms who held the power now. My children would see not just my wealth, but my control, my influence, the undeniable fact that I had risen from the ashes they had created. I invited them to my house, again, not out of forgiveness, not out of reconciliation, but to confront the truth. The house gleamed under the evening lights, every detail immaculate, every shadow calculated to impress, intimidate, and overwhelm. The Rolls-Royce sat at the entrance, a silent, gleaming symbol of what they had dismissed. As they pulled up, hesitation rippled across their faces. I could see the recognition, the sudden fear, the dawning understanding that this wasn't the same Mary they had thrown out. I greeted them calmly, my voice soft, measured, carrying the weight of every injustice I had endured. "Welcome," I said, letting the word hang in the air, heavy with irony and power. They shuffled inside, eyes darting, lips tight, every step tentative. They didn't know whether to be angry, ashamed, or terrified. Perhaps all three. And I watched, savoring the uncertainty, the unraveling of the arrogance they once carried like armor.
I began to guide them through the house, letting every room, every object tell a story they couldn't ignore. The luxurious decor, the subtle placement of trophies, awards, and reminders of my new life. It was all intentional. Each glance, each reaction from them fed into my plan. My son's hands shook slightly as he touched a piece of furniture he had once thought inaccessible. My daughter's eyes darted nervously to the view outside the window, realizing for the first time how completely I had surrounded them with my presence, my influence. Then I addressed the inheritance. Not with gloating, not with harsh words, but with deliberate clarity. I reminded them of their father's decision, the wealth he had entrusted to me, the foresight he had shown in protecting me. "He believed in me," I said softly, letting the simplicity of the truth strike them harder than any anger could. "Even when you didn't." Their faces fell. Their arrogance, their sense of entitlement, it crumbled in a slow, painful erosion. And I could see it, the first cracks of desperation. My daughter tried to reach out, to touch my arm, to beg forgiveness. I allowed her the gesture, but I didn't reciprocate. I let the moment stretch, letting her feel the chasm she had created between us. My son's eyes burned with frustration, and I could see him wrestling with the truth he had long refused to face. I had won. I had risen while they had faltered, and now they were utterly dependent on my mercy. I began to press the advantage, letting subtle statements of power drip into conversation. I mentioned business deals, acquisitions, social connections, all of which had been executed quietly, methodically, leaving them in awe, fear, and frustration. Each fact, each revelation was like a carefully placed domino, knocking down the walls of pride and control they had built around themselves. Their desperation became palpable, their attempts to regain control increasingly frantic, increasingly futile. At one point, I paused, letting the silence stretch, letting them feel the weight of their mistake. "Do you understand now? Do you see what happens when you underestimate someone, when you discard the person who loves you most?" My daughter's voice trembled, barely audible. We were wrong, Mom." My son's jaw tightened, but the tension in his shoulders betrayed him. They were broken.
Not physically, but mentally, emotionally. The reckoning had begun.
And I realized something in that moment. Revenge isn't just about the act itself. It's about transformation. It's about showing people the consequences of their actions, letting them confront the truth and watching as they face the reality they had ignored for so long. Every step of my plan, every subtle move, every calculated moment had led to this, the undeniable demonstration that I was no longer the powerless mother they had dismissed. I was the architect of their reckoning. I could see the questions forming in their minds, the doubts, the guilt, the fear. They were wondering how long I had waited, how much I had planned, how thoroughly I had rebuilt my life without them even noticing. And I let them wonder. The tension, the uncertainty, the helplessness, it was all part of the climax I had been building toward for months. And I have to ask you this. If it were your children, if they had cast you aside, would you have stopped here? Would a simple confrontation have satisfied you? Or would you have wanted them to truly feel the weight of their choices, to understand in their bones the consequences of underestimating you? That, my friends, is the difference between revenge and justice. By now, the full weight of what I had orchestrated was bearing down on them, and I could see it in every twitch, every faltering word, every glance that betrayed panic and regret. My son's arrogance had dissolved into helplessness. My daughter's faux bravado had crumbled into trembling uncertainty. They were staring at me not as a mother, not as family, but as an unstoppable force they had once dismissed. And I let them sit in that realization, savoring every second of it. I decided it was time to show them the final pieces of the life they had thought they could deny me. The private jet contracts, the overseas properties, the charitable foundations, the business empires, they were all mine, quietly, methodically acquired, each one a statement of what they had underestimated. I walked them through the facts, calmly, as if recounting mundane details of the day, but with each revelation, their world tilted further off balance. My son's face paled. My daughter clutched her hand over her mouth. I could feel the panic radiating off them, a wave that nearly made my own pulse race with anticipation.
And then I pressed the most personal advantage. The house across the street. The Rolls-Royce parked conspicuously outside, a symbol they couldn't ignore. Every choice has consequences, I said quietly, letting my gaze linger, making sure they understood the full scope. You chose to cast me out. You chose to accuse me falsely. And this, I gestured to the life I had rebuilt, is what happens when you underestimate someone you claim to love. Their silence was deafening, the weight of shame and fear pressing down like a physical force. I could see their thoughts spiraling. How had I done this? How had they missed every sign? How could one person rise so completely while they had floundered in ignorance and anger? The questions swirled in their eyes, desperation clawing at the edges of their composure. And that's when I realized something. The climax of revenge isn't about making noise. It's about making someone feel powerless in a way they've never felt before. And I had achieved it. I let them stumble through apologies, broken and hesitant, their words fumbling, their emotions raw. I didn't interrupt. I didn't defend myself. I let them feel the full weight of every accusation they had thrown at me, every cruel statement they had whispered in the hours after their father's death. They were facing me now, completely exposed, stripped of pride, stripped of pretense, forced to confront the reality they had created. My daughter finally whispered, tears spilling down her cheeks, "Mom, please, we were wrong. Please forgive us." I let the silence stretch, letting her feel the gravity of the distance they had created. My son's hands trembled, his jaw tight, voice choked. We didn't see it. We didn't know. I smiled quietly, a soft, almost imperceptible smile, and said, "Now you see." But I didn't need to gloat, didn't need to shout or lecture. The real victory was in their realization, in the helplessness they could feel as they understood that the power dynamics had shifted completely. I was no longer at their mercy. I was the one holding the cards, and they were utterly dependent on my grace. That, my friends, is the point where revenge truly satisfies. Not in the act itself, but in the collapse, in the slow, grinding recognition of the truth. And as I watched them sit there, broken, trembling, unable to articulate how far their world had tilted, I felt something unexpected, a strange, quiet sense of peace. This wasn't just revenge. This was balance. This was justice. They had thrown me aside, judged me unfairly, dismissed my love and loyalty, and now they were forced to confront the consequences. And I, at last, could breathe again, knowing that the wrongs done to me had been answered fully, deliberately, with the kind of precision that left no ambiguity. I asked them quietly, letting the words hang in the air, "Do you understand now what it means to underestimate someone?" My daughter nodded, broken, my son silent, face tight with disbelief. And in that moment, I realized the final truth of it. Revenge, when executed carefully, when planned patiently, when delivered with intent, doesn't just hurt the other person, it transforms you. I was no longer the grieving widow, the powerless mother. I was whole, powerful, untouchable, and finally free from the shadow of their cruelty. After that night, things changed. Not just for my children, but for me. The power I had reclaimed wasn't just external, it was internal. I walked through my house, through the life I had rebuilt, and for the first time in months, maybe years, I felt a sense of peace. Not loud, not dramatic, but quiet and steady. The chaos of grief, betrayal, and fear that had consumed me was replaced with clarity. I had endured the unimaginable, been cast aside by my own family, and yet here I stood, unbroken, untouchable, and finally in control. My children, of course, were different. The arrogance that once defined them was replaced with hesitation, caution, and, most importantly, respect. They moved through the house carefully, aware now that their assumptions and cruelty had consequences. They didn't approach me as the mother who had once been powerless, the grieving widow they had discarded. They approached me as someone they could no longer take for granted, someone whose presence alone carried weight, whose decisions shaped their reality. And I allowed it.
There were moments of quiet tension, of lingering unease, where I watched them realize that forgiveness couldn't erase what had happened, that trust couldn't be restored instantly, that their mistakes had been monumental, and the memory of underestimating me would stay with them forever. And I let those moments linger, because justice isn't always about retribution. It's about understanding. It's about letting people face the weight of their actions and the consequences of their choices. I thought often about what I had learned through this journey, that power is not just money, influence, or appearances. It is patience, clarity, and precision. It is the ability to endure, to plan, to observe, and to act when the time is right. It is about turning pain into purpose, betrayal into strategy, and grief into transformation. And above all, it is about never letting anyone convince you that you are nothing when you are everything. Sometimes I catch myself smiling quietly when I see them in the neighborhood, or when a neighbor mentions some subtle success of mine they've overheard. There's no gloating, no overt triumph, just the quiet satisfaction of knowing that I survived,
that I rebuilt, that I reclaimed everything they tried to take from me. And I think about the question I asked myself so many times during this process. Would you have waited this long for revenge? And I know the answer now, without hesitation, yes. Because the sweetest victories are those that are carefully earned, patiently executed, and fully realized. And now, when I think back to that moment on the curb after the funeral, when I had nothing but grief and betrayal, I realize how far I've come. They didn't know the power their father had entrusted to me, the strength they had underestimated. And in reclaiming it, I reclaimed myself. I am no longer defined by their assumptions, their anger, or their cruelty. I am defined by my own resilience, my intelligence, and the careful precision with which I rebuilt my life. So, if you've ever been underestimated, dismissed, or thrown away by people you trusted, know this: you are stronger than you realize. Revenge isn't about immediate gratification. It's about patience, planning, and rising to a point where your presence alone reminds everyone of what they lost, what they ignored, and what they can never take from you. And that, my friends, is the ultimate form of closure. As I stand on my balcony looking out at the life I've created, I sometimes wonder, if my children had only understood sooner, if they had only trusted, could things have been different? But I don't dwell on that. I don't regret the lessons I've learned or the power I've claimed. Instead, I savor the quiet knowledge that justice, when executed with patience and precision, is more powerful than anger, more enduring than rage, and more satisfying than any fleeting act of retaliation. And in the end, that's what matters. Not the money, not the house, not the Rolls-Royce, although they are reminders of what I've accomplished. What matters is the transformation, the reclamation, the knowledge that I am no longer powerless, no longer invisible, and no longer dismissed. And when I think of my children now, I feel a complex mix of sorrow, triumph, and quiet hope that perhaps in time they will understand the lessons I've demonstrated and the consequences of underestimating someone they loved so dearly. The days that followed felt almost surreal. Life had shifted in ways my children could never have imagined, and yet it was quiet now, not in the way that life after chaos usually is, but in a way that felt complete. I moved through my home with a sense of ease, each room a testament to the patience, intelligence, and strength I had cultivated. I had turned pain into purpose, betrayal into strategy, and grief into something profoundly empowering. My children still lingered in the neighborhood, still watched, still whispered, but now they were shadows in my story rather than co-authors. They approached me cautiously, trying to reconcile, trying to recover what they had lost. But I held the power, not because I wanted to punish them endlessly, but because I had earned the right to choose how, when, and if I would engage. And I savored that choice every single day. Sometimes I would watch them through the window, the subtle flinch when my Rolls-Royce rolled past, the careful hesitation when they considered speaking to me. And I realized that revenge, when executed with precision and patience, is as much about teaching as it is about triumph. They had learned the hard way that power is not granted, it is claimed, that love and trust are not to be dismissed lightly, and that underestimating someone you care about can have consequences you never imagined. Yet, despite everything, I found a quiet softness within me. Revenge had its satisfaction, yes, but closure brought peace. I forgave them, not because they deserved it, not because the past could be erased, but because holding on to resentment would have been letting them control my emotions, even now. I could be powerful, wealthy, untouchable, and still humane. I realized that was the true victory. Not the money, not the luxury, not the Rolls-Royce or the mansion, but the reclamation of my own life, my own spirit, my own dignity. And I often asked myself quietly in those moments of solitude, what would you have done in my shoes?
Would you have waited this long, plotted this carefully, endured this long for the satisfaction of true justice? I know the answer now. Yes, because revenge without patience is just anger. Revenge with patience, precision, and strategy, it is transformation. It changes you as much as it changes the world around you. I began to live fully, unapologetically, with a sense of joy I hadn't known in years. The neighborhood whispered, the world watched, and my children finally understood that the woman they had dismissed was no longer powerless. She was unstoppable. And there was a strange, beautiful poetry in that even in the midst of betrayal, even after grief that could have broken me, I had found my strength, my agency, my life renewed. Sometimes I think back to the day I was thrown out, sitting on that curb with nothing but grief and flowers at my feet. I remember the shock, the disbelief, the aching pain of being discarded by the very people I loved. And I smile now, quietly, because they didn't know. They didn't know the depth of my resilience, the patience of my mind, the fire of my determination. And they learned. Oh, they learned. And as I stand on my balcony, looking out at the world I've rebuilt, I feel a profound sense of completion. Revenge, closure, transformation, they are intertwined. And I am whole. I am powerful. I am Mary. The woman they tried to erase now defines her own destiny, and nothing, no grief, no betrayal, no underestimation, can ever take that away from me. So if you've ever been dismissed, betrayed, or underestimated, remember this. The power to reclaim your life is already within you. Sometimes it takes patience, sometimes strategy, sometimes courage, but it is always there. And when you claim it, when you rise, when you take back what is yours, you are unstoppable. That is the final truth. That is the ultimate victory. And that is my story. Thank you so much for watching and listening to my story. I hope it kept you on the edge of your seat and gave you a little thrill along the way. If you enjoyed it, don't forget to leave a comment. I'd love to hear what you would have done in my shoes. And of course, like and subscribe so you don't miss any of my stories. Your support means the world, and I can't wait to share the next one with you.